But I'm going to talk today about the subject of the Tower of Babel, or Babel. Babel. How do you guys say it? Mostly Babel. I think I heard a couple of Babels in there. Goes to show the effects are definitely still in from a language split, right? But, here in the United States, we typically say it either way, Babel or Babel. I know in places like Australia or England, it's typically Babel, is typically how they do it. And I've typically said Tower of Babel, so forgive me if you're not used to hearing that. But the Tower of Babel comes under attack, especially in today's culture. For those of you who are familiar with what's going on in our culture, there is a battle over the Bible. And that battle particularly is raging in Genesis chapters 1 through Genesis chapter 11. Of course, the events that occurred in the Tower of Babel are in Genesis chapter 11, and then the breakdown of the splitting in Genesis chapter 10, the chapter before that. But there are a lot of attacks on the Tower of Babel specifically, not just with creation. When you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 right in there, you also have attacks on the flood there in Genesis chapter 6 and Tower of Babel, Genesis 10, 11, we see attacks there too. So what kind of attacks are there? One of the big attacks that I see, and I'm going to address this throughout the rest of this talk, is the claim that it's mythology. There are people who say it's just a myth. You type in Tower of Babel on the internet, and some of the first things that pop up is Wikipedia, the encyclopedia that changes every day, that's very anti-Christian. First thing it says, it's an origin myth. You look up Encyclopedia Britannica, another one of the top hits, mythological tower. You know what? People are being drilled with this. And I guarantee kids are taught this left and right, either from their peers or from different history books and things like that they've been taught. Well, there are other attacks. One of the big attacks that we see in today's culture is on racism. And I actually want to address that and then come back to the claim of mythology. So, this issue of races in our culture, it's a big one, isn't it? I've been to various parts around the world. I've been to Sweden. I've been down to South America. I've been to Australia, here in the United States. There's a lot of forms of racism out there. I've seen different forms in some of these different places that I was at. Some of it shocked me. And it blows my mind. And some of you might be sitting there going, wow, you know what? There is bad racism in our culture. You might even think of instances where someone was racist to you, or sometimes you may not realize you might have been racist to someone else, didn't even know it. But you know what? We all go back to Adam and Eve. So from a big picture, how many races of mankind are there? One. That's tough for us to think about sometimes, isn't it? One race. We all go back to one blood. We all go back to Adam and Eve. Paul, in Acts chapter 17, when he went to the Greeks, he made this argument. He says here, this is talking of God, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of the dwellings. One blood. We all go back to one man. We all go back to Adam and Eve. We're all related. This is a family reunion. You guys didn't even know it. You're related to me, and you're up there like, great, I'm related to this guy. But see, if we think from a biblical viewpoint, we start with Adam and Eve. They have other sons and daughters in Genesis 5:4. That answers that famous question, where did Cain get his wife? That age-old question, right? Well, it was a sister. It could have been a niece, but either way, brothers and sisters originally had to marry. And that was okay originally. It wasn't until the time of Moses that God said, no more close intermarriage. And we see that in Leviticus chapter 18, for example. Well, at any rate, we have the bottleneck at the flood of Noah's day. Only 8 people survive. They come off the ark. The Lord says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But no, the descendants of Noah came together and said, let's not be scattered. Let's build a tower and a city, and let's not be scattered. And of course, the Lord comes down, and if you're going to try to defy God, he is going to win. And he confuses their language and scatters people to various parts of the world. And look, we have people that are probably here from all over the world, and there are people probably watching this from all over the world. So what about racism in our culture? They're everywhere. Racist acts are everywhere. It's sad to see it. You can hop on any given day and type racist acts, and there's going to be news items all over the place. I do this from time to time and change these slides up. But all the time we see these types of things. These are hate crimes. And it's sad to see this kind of stuff. We as Christians should be fighting the fight against racism. Now, I'm assuming that most people who come to the Creation Museum are Christians. However, we do have a lot of people who come through who are not Christians. If you're not here a Christian, we welcome you here. We actually hope you're having a great time, but we also hope you're challenged, particularly to consider the claims of Christ. Because, friends, that's what this is all about. We're not just here to talk about racism or the flood or Babel or whatever it might be. We want to see people want to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We want people walking out of here going, wow, you know what? The Bible is trustworthy. And because the Bible's trustworthy, the message of the gospel founded in that book is also trustworthy. But racist acts are all over the place. Odabinga, this is, if you look back in the past here in the United States, he was a pygmy from Africa. And if you just look him up and find out some of the atrocities that he underwent, it's just horrible. They actually put him in cages with the orangutans, put him on display with the animals, saying, hey, look, he's a missing link. Christians petitioned, they finally got him out. But a couple of years later, as I recall, he actually ended up committing suicide. If you look at Nazi Germany, go back to, say, the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, there was actually a breeding program, as sad as it is to say, that the Nazis were doing. It was called Lebensborn. Now, you have to understand what they were doing. They were trying to breed a master race. And they had this idea, blonde hair, blue-eyed, this was more superior. They did forced sterilizations of people they didn't want. When they conquered places like Norway, they took a lot of people that they viewed as being more in the superior line, and they actually made them have children with some of their SS soldiers and so forth. But you have to understand the way the Nazis were thinking. Hitler, in his book Mein Kampf, he also has a second book simply titled Hitler's Second Book. He was a diehard evolutionist. And here's what the Nazis and Hitler were thinking. They're thinking, well, apes had dark skin, so lighter skin is more evolved. Apes had dark hair, so lighter hair, like blonde hair perhaps, or maybe even no hair, is more evolved. Apes have dark eyes, so maybe things like big blue eyes are more evolved. Apes have small brains, so big brains are more evolved. I always wonder what they were shooting for. That actually fits the description, as sad as it is. But you see, this was the mentality. This was the thinking that was going on during that time. We also see horrible atrocities committed down in Australia. A lot of Aborigines, their bones were taken from graves. I think they estimated somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 graves were desecrated. There's even historical records where some of the Aborigines were hunted. Their bodies they had guidelines on how you prepare the body to be sent to various museums around the world. Maybe about 15 years ago or so, people started passing laws to return those bodies to Australia for proper burial. But you see, racist acts are all over the place. And here's what it comes down to. It comes down to an issue of authority. Either God is the authority, or if you reject God as the authority, then by default, man becomes the authority. It's God's word versus man's word. The evolutionary ideas are one of the many types of man's words that's floating around in our culture. The fact is that dominates much of the Western world now. And I want to encourage you to start with God and His Word. There is no greater thinking than God. God created all things. God knows all things. God upholds all things. It would be crazy for Christians not to start with the Word of God to develop their thinking in any area, including the issues of racism. So if we start with God and His Word, man was created supernaturally and unique from all of the creatures. You jump back to Genesis 2, verse 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Hey, let me ask you, is this too hard for an all-powerful God? No, this is all too easy, right? It's all too easy. Now, man, of course, was made in the image of God. The woman, Genesis 2:22, also made in the image of God here. Then the rib, which the Lord God had taken from the man, He made into a woman, and He brought her to the man. This isn't too hard either for an all-powerful God. I've had some people say, he took maybe rib and flesh, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh from Adam. Well, shouldn't she have been a clone of Adam? No, this is God we're talking about. It's not a problem for Him to make a woman from a man. It's all too easy. Bear that in mind. In fact, it's not too hard for an all-powerful God to create all things in 6 days. Sometimes we should be asking the question, why did He take so long? Of course, Exodus 20, verse 11 answers that. He did it for our benefit. Do it in 6 days, rest for a seventh. That's the basis for our work week. In fact, that's ultimately why we have a weekend. You see, a weekend's a Christian thing. It's very nice of the world to borrow that from us, by the way. But I've had people say, yeah, okay, fine. We go back, we're one race, we all go back to Adam and Eve, but why do people look so different? I've had people say, well, there's red people and white people and yellow people and black people and so forth. Well, let's look at this issue in a little bit more detail. We do have variation. I look out here today, we have variation. I see people who are taller, some people who are shorter, some people who are skinnier, some people who are whiter. That's a good way of putting that, right? I see people with lots of hair, some with no hair, different shades of hair, different eye colors and eye shapes and so forth. Yes, we have variation, and that's a good thing. But see, that goes back to our DNA. DNA does not stand for the National Dyslexia Association. couple of you guys got that right off the bat. Good on you. Have some fun with this, right? It's a tough subject, but hey, let's have some fun with it. But yeah, our DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, this is what codes for how you're really going to look. So, for example, we have about 3 billion base pairs in our DNA. So that's a lot of information, actually, when you start putting it together. Just to give you a taste of how much information is in our genome with that 3 billion base pairs, that would be equivalent to about 1,000 books of 500 pages of information. Whew, that gives you a taste of the mind of God, doesn't it? Just incredible when you think about it. But your DNA codes for things. Now, ultimately, it codes for our skin shade, our eye shape, our eye color, our hair amount, hair amount. Oh, I'm losing my hair. I need to talk to my genetics about that. That came from my mom and dad, right? Go have a talk with them. But you see, it codes for these types of things. Now, just to give you a taste, yes, there's 3 billion base pairs. There's a lot of information in there. But let's think of it like this. Let's say we have a male and a female. How many different children can they have without two children being absolutely identical? This is with the exception of identical twins or triplets where it's the same DNA that splits. Do you know what that number is? 10 to the power 2017. That is a 1 with 2017 zeros following it. Wow. I mean, step back. Wow. You can't even comprehend this number. Let me give you a comparison so that you can see this number. The estimated number of atoms in the known universe is 10 to the power 80th. Gives you an idea of the mind of God when it comes to all the variations that are possible. That's an immense amount of information that's in our genome. But let's look at this a little bit more. Red, yellow, black, and white. How do we get this variation? In Genesis chapter 1, it talks about things being created after their kind or according to their kind. You have a dog kind, a cat kind, an elephant kind. Let me test you. Dogs breed with dogs and you get? Dogs. Yeah, cats breed with cats and you get? Cats. There you have it. That's the Bible's biology. You guys have it real easy. So, do you guys want me to use cats or dogs as an example? I heard about 98% dogs and a couple of really solid cat examples. We're going to use the dogs. Okay, when it comes to dogs, do they change? Do animals change? Yes, they do change. Don't they? I mean, just consider some of the dogs on here. You got one here that looks like a wolf on the far left. You move in, you got a long-eared dog. That's kind of a pretty dog. Shaggy dog. Oh, really ugly dog. Oh, that's a cute little dog, that little brown one. That's a really ugly dog. And that, well, it looks like a rat, but it's a dog. Those chihuahuas, they're so ugly, they put clothes on those things in Hollywood. Whew. I'm just picking on the chihuahua. But the point is, we have a lot of variations in dogs. Yes, dogs change. We see a host of varieties of dogs. We have a lot of species of dogs. You have variations within foxes and wolves, but these are all part of the dog kind, coyotes and so forth. We have tons of different dogs floating all over the place. Now, even when it comes to domestic dogs, we have a lot of variety of domestic dogs, but all the domestic dogs are actually considered one species. Now, how do you get this variation of dogs? Let's think biblically. Let's go back to the time of the flood. Noah comes off the ark. He had 2 of each kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal on board the ark, which means he had 2 dogs on board the ark. All the dogs we have today are the descendants of those 2 dogs. So let's say we're going to look at those 2 dogs on board Noah's ark. There they are. Let's say these 2 dogs fall in love and get married. That's why you got the little hearts up there, make it look pretty, right? Now, I'm going to give you some genetics. I'm going to do it basic. It's actually more complicated than this, but don't let it scare you. Let's say the S and the L here on these dogs stand for a gene to produce short hair, that's the S, or L, long hair. Like I said, it's more complicated. But let's say when those 2 are together, that expresses medium-length fur. So let's say both of the dogs on board Noah's Ark had medium-length fur. They each had an S and an L in their genetics. So these 2 dogs come off the ark, and they start to have babies. Well, they could have short-hair babies because both of them could send the short-hair gene down. Or they could have dogs that also have medium-length fur where one sends a short, one sends a long. Or you could get some that have long hair, all in one generation. Look at that. One generation. You can get variation in that. So how do these dogs then go to different parts of the world and get variation? Well, if you know anything about dogs, dogs like to produce dogs. So dogs have dogs, and after a while you end up with lots of dogs, not to be confused with hot dogs, because you can eat a hot dog. You may not want to eat a hot dog if you know what's in a hot dog. Dogs would eat a hot dog, but if dogs knew what were in a hot dog, they'd eat it anyway. The point is you end up with lots of dogs. And these dogs start to go to different parts of the world. They start off there in the Middle East. They're going to different parts of the world. Some dogs go to where it's cold. Some dogs go to where it's hot. Now, think about this. Let's say you have some dogs go up north where it starts to get really cold. And so they go up there. The dogs with short hair or medium-length fur, they don't like that. So they're either going to move away or die out. So you're going to be left with dogs that only have long-haired genes. So the dogs that are up north, they all have long-haired genes. So the only babies that they could have are little babies with long-haired genes. You see that? So you're stuck with a whole population of dogs that only have long hair. Well, let's say you have some dogs that say, hey, I'm going to go down to a hot place. So they go down here. Well, the dogs with medium-length fur or long fur, they don't like that. They're going to move away or die off. So you're going to be left with dogs with short hair. Well, as soon as you have that, the only babies they can have are dogs with short hair because they've lost the information for long hair. In the same way, the dogs that went up north, they lost the information for short hair. Now, I want you to notice, this is not an evolutionary change. This is dogs changing into dogs. Some have longer hair, some have shorter hair. Not that big of a deal, when you step back and think about this. But notice how it's a filtering or a losing of information. So think about this. Big picture, you got dogs. You have one dog type ultimately. So you have the wolf, the coyote, the dingoes, the collies. These are all part of the one dog kind. Dingoes have lost the information for long hair. Collies have lost the information for short hair. Chihuahuas have lost a lot of information. That actually sounded like a chihuahua. That was awesome. You may not have picked that up out on the internet, but that was brilliant. But I want you to notice this is a filtering or a losing of information. We've lost some of this information. Now, see, an evolutionary change is different. Consider, let's say you start with a single-celled organism like an amoeba or some sort of a fungi. This thing, for it to evolve all the way up here into a dog, you need to add information to its genome. You need to add information for fur, add information for a brain, add information for a circulatory system, or all these different systems that are in the body. But we're not observing those changes. What we're seeing is just variations here within the dogs. Same sort of thing within the chicken kind or so forth. We see variations within those. For example, we have a lot of varieties of chickens. I've actually seen some of these Transylvanian naked-neck chickens. They're kind of ugly-looking things, but hey, you know what? We have variations within the chicken kind. Chickens and pheasants, for example, can interbreed. Pheasants are like wild chickens, essentially. We have variations within the horse kind. Zebras are actually part of the horse kind. You can get a Zorse or a Zonkey where these things are actually interbreeding with each other. So yes, we have variations within those particular kinds. Now, what about people? If we're going to step back and look at people from a biblical viewpoint, we're all related. Yes, we're going to have the variation, but people are a little bit different. When it came to those dogs, nature was affecting them. That is called natural selection. Darwin did not come up with natural selection. Actually, a Christian man by the name of Ed Blythe came up with that about 25 years before Darwin, trying to explain variations within these kinds. Darwin took it and said maybe that leads to evolution. But people are different. When we go to a cold place, we don't die off, do we? No, we build a house, put clothes on, build a fire. We defy it, essentially. We go to a hot place, we battle against that sort of thing as well. So we're not acted on by the elements like the way a lot of these animals are. So how do we get the variation? That red and yellow, black and white, and so forth. Actually, I don't like to say red and yellow, black and white. I actually like to say brown. You know why? In our genetics tell us to produce a brownish pigment called melanin that appears in your skin. There's actually two forms of it. Now, the National Geographic decided to line up some girls here in a classroom. Look at this, really light to really dark, boom. And you can see it's basically one color, isn't it? It's just what shade of that color is it. You got more melanin in your skin, you have less melanin in your skin. I'm probably somewhere in here. That's probably about where I'm at, just to give you an idea. So we're all kind of brownish. Some are more brown, some are less brown. I've had people say, but Bodie, you're white. No, guys, this is white. I don't look like this. If I looked like this, call a Hearst. Ambulance, it's too late for that. Yeah, we're all kind of brownish. Now, let's look at the genetics of mankind to talk about this brownish pigment because we have a whole host of variations all the way in there. Now, I'm going to step it up a little bit with my genetics. Don't let it scare you. But I'm going to have a capital A and capital B stand for genes that say produce lots of melanin. Small a and small b mean to produce smaller amounts of melanin. So basically, if you get all capital letters, you're going to be darker. If you get all small letters, you're going to be lighter. If you're somewhere in between, you're going to be somewhere in between. So let's put this into our famous Punnett square here. You can have really dark to really light in one generation if people started out in the middle. It's real easy, actually. I've had people say, but we don't really observe that. Yes, we do. Look at these two little beautiful twins. Both of the parents have a light and dark parent, and they came out kind of middle brown. And they have these beautiful twins, Kian and Remy here. This is pictures when they're a little bit older. Dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin. One generation twins. We see a lot of examples of twins. I like to use the examples of twins. Here's Cheryl and Karen. Another set. This is over in the UK. Leighton and Caden. Ryan and Leo. Oh, here's a good one. Twin Credibles. 2 sets of two-tone twins. How cool is that? That is incredible when you think about this. Yes, we can get variation in skin tone in one generation. It's fairly easy. But it's the same sort of thing with regards to eye color. More melanin, less melanin. And you can get variations all in between. Genetics, it also explains eye shape variation. Do you have more of the almond-shaped eye or do you have more of the rounded eye? The point is, when it comes down to it, the biological fact is that all humans belong to one race, the human race. And the event that triggered us to be split apart was not nature, it wasn't the environment. No, it was the events that occurred at the Tower of Babel. As different family groups went to different parts of the world, that split apart the gene pool. People went to the Orient, took genes for the almond-shaped eye. People went to Africa, took genes for darker skin. People went to Europe, took genes for lighter skin, but we're all related, which means we're all sinners and we're all in need of Jesus Christ, no matter what we look like. So why is racism so prevalent in our culture? Did you ever stop to think about why it is? I would suggest one of the main reasons is the evolution of man. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying racism was caused by the idea of evolution. Racism was around before that. Racism ultimately goes back to sin. That's what it goes back to. But I would suggest as a result of an evolutionary worldview, a lot more people started to buy into a racist philosophy. And there's reasons for it. Let me explain that. If you look at the secular timeline, they say there was nothing. No time, no space, nothing at all. Then something pops into existence from nothing and rapidly explodes or expands. They call that the Big Bang. They claim this happened anywhere from about 13 to 15 billion years ago. The numbers tend to vary. And then you get the sun, moon, and the stars and all that sort of stuff. Finally get the first seas. They said the earth was molten like lava and had to cool off. They say finally chemicals come together and form the first life, and it evolves further and further and further to where you get some sort of monkey-like creature that evolves into some sort of ape-like creature, and the ape-like creature then splits into the modern apes and the human line. And if you look at that human line, here's what they say. You get a multitude of races that come out of that. Early evolutionists used to sometimes have a whole host of variations of races, some of them as high as 30. But usually they settled on about 4 or 5, and these are the racist names that they gave to them. And you might recognize some of these names. Now, I don't like these names, but this is what the early evolutionists used. Negroid, Australoid, Mongoloid, and the Caucasoid. Some of these terminologies are still used even today. How many people out here with lighter skin, with European descent, you fill out a government form that says, what race are you? And you put Caucasian. That's the evolutionary race right there. You can see how that's infiltrated even our governmental system, this particular viewpoint. Now, I want you to understand the term race has actually changed over the years. You go back 200 years ago, somebody said, hey, what race are you? I'm the Irish race, or the German race, or the English race, or the West African race, or the Chinese race. People don't use it that way anymore, do they? No. They think in terms of the evolutionary race. You see, the term race has actually been redefined and means something different now. Now, like I said, I don't like to use this terminology, but in the evolutionary worldview, they actually would start to lump these. They would put the Australoid at the bottom, then the Negroid, then the Mongoloid, and then they'd put the Caucasoid on top. For example, Ernst Haeckel, one of the early evolutionists, he's the one who popularized an evolutionary worldview to the German people. He was kind of a contemporary here, a little bit of Charles Darwin, and actually was more popular probably a little bit after his time. But he popularized it there. That actually led to things like Nazism. But one of the things he says here, at the lowest stage of human mental development are the Australians. Some tribes of the Polynesians and the Bushmen, the Hottentots, and some of the Negro tribes. Like I said, this is his terminology. What they're doing is they're saying, well, these people who have darker skin, they're down here closer to the apes. That's really what they said. Where did he get this idea from? He got it from Darwin himself. In Darwin's second book, The Descent of Man, this was published in 1871, it says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphic apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla. You know what he's saying here? The Caucasians up here, the baboons are here, there's everything in between. We need to wipe all that stuff out, and then maybe the Caucasian can evolve even further. That's what he's saying. That's what the Nazis and Hitler tried to do. It's sad to see that sort of thing. Makes sense why a lot of the Australians were targets. The graves were desecrated, they were hunted, bodies put on display. It's terrible to see this kind of stuff. Now, like I said, evolution is not the cause of racism, but it really increased. Stephen Jay Gould, he was a professor at Harvard University, died a few years back now. He made this statement. He said, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. So even the evolutionists agreed that an evolutionary worldview added fuel to that fire. Oh, but Bodie, aren't there all these missing links that prove evolution? Nope, there isn't. You see, you need to understand something about missing links. There are three ways people try to make a missing link. The first is you take bones from a human and you take bones of an ape, you put them together and try to make a missing link. Now, is that a real creature? No, it's not, because you took bones of a human, bones of an ape. The second way to make a missing link is you take an ape, try to make it look like a human. The third way is you take a human, you try to make it look like an ape. Really good examples of this are Homo habilis for this first category. Let's say you got a box, and you're looking around for a missing link somewhere in Africa because that's where the apes were. Oh, here's a bone. I don't know what it is. Throw it in the box. 20 miles away, somewhere else, you find a bone. I don't know what bone it is. Throw it in the box. 100 miles away, I don't know what this one is. Throw it in the box. After a while, you pour your box of bones out and you build a missing link. But that's not a real creature. You probably have bones of a human, bones of apes all mixed up together. So that's not even a real one. The second one here, Lucy, is an excellent example of that. Australopithecine afarensis. It's an ape. That's all it is. We've actually measured out the bones. Each of the bones that was found with Lucy fit within the line of a chimpanzee, very close. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. The jaw is a little bit bigger. The carrying angle in the hips, a little bit higher. But by and large, it's just a variant form of a chimpanzee. But you know, you look at some of the artist representations and some of the images they have of Lucy in museums, and they have it standing upright. They got human hands and feet on it and human eyes. It looks like it's thinking. They put human features on this ape. The third way, a good example, is Neanderthal. Neanderthals are human. They wore clothes. They buried their dead. They made musical instruments. All the features of a Neanderthal within the human population even today. A lot of people think Neanderthal, oh, wow, it's got that big ridge brow. There are humans that have big ridge brows. I have a friend, he's got this ridge brow that make Neanderthals jealous. I keep saying, please let me take a picture of you from the side. No, he won't let me do it, but one of these days I might convince him. But the point is, they were human. They were clearly human. And even the secular world now agrees that Neanderthals and humans were interbreeding, and you know, we've been able to check genetic code and that sort of thing. They were clearly human. Now, there are a lot of missing links that are floating around out there. And sometimes you just need to look through the fancy lingo. What is it? Is it a human? Is it an ape? Or is it some other category here? You know, a couple of the examples, Neanderthal was human. Australopithecine afarensis, Lucy, is an ape. Hey, look down here, Homo habilis, that's the junk category, just to give you a taste. Now, if you guys want to know a little bit more about this particular subject, I suggest a book called One Race, One Blood. Ken Ham and Dr. Charles Ware put this book together. It looks at the scientific, cultural, and theological and biblical aspects of this in our culture. And I'll mention this a little bit more. But what I want to do now is I kind of want to transition in my talk, and I want to move more over to the Tower of Babel itself and talk about that and talk about the people groups and so forth. So how does all this relate to Babel? Well, let's go back and actually read the Babel account, particularly the chronological account, Genesis 11, 1 through 9. So follow me here. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." Genesis 11, 7 through 9. "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. You see, the Lord had given them the command after the flood to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. If God would let them get away with defying him, then they could get away with anything. And he wasn't going to let them get away with that. But we read this, 9 verses, that's believable. Why would people suddenly just throw this out as a myth? You know why? Because an evolutionary worldview teaches something different. How many of you have been taught, man evolved out of Africa from lower creatures, we were dumb brutes, we had to get smart enough to stop being hunters and gatherers, and wow, we got smart enough to plant some of our own crops and start getting some of our own food, and wow, we got smart enough to make some rudimentary tools and some rudimentary types of shelters. Finally, we got smart enough to make some of our own houses, and then we got smart enough to make our own civilizations like Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, or Egypt, and places like that. Have you guys ever heard stuff like that? I heard it all the time, from a kid all the way up. So when you see something like this, they automatically want to throw it to mythology. But guess what? That little evolutionary history that I told you right there, guess what? Not a single ancient historian ever mentioned anything of the sort. That is a brand new rewritten history that's been imposed upon generations. Cultures all over the world actually kept track of their own history. And I want to look at some of that history. And see, this relates to different people groups, different cultures all over the world. See, that's how this all relates. Genesis chapter 10, if you jump back one chapter, it gives, those genealogies that nobody likes to read. It's got the names. You're like, oh, I hope I don't have to read this one at Bible study, You guys are all laughing like you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is Genesis chapter 10. This is all those names, but it's put in a graphic form. You have Noah, you have his 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And I know this might be difficult for some of you to read back in the back. But then you have grandsons down here. Then you have some great-grandsons and some great-great-grandsons, some great-great-great-grandsons, great-great-great-great-grandsons. Okay? If I got that right. But you see, all these people came out, their families, with a new language. And I want to look at some of these peoples. And I want to look at some of the archaeology. And I want to show, hey, this is not a mythological event. This is the real history. That other history that the evolutionists have been teaching, that is actually the mythological history. One of the first things I want to show you is the Tower of Babel stele. It's a rock. It's not made of steel. But this is an incredible archaeological find. It's got the Tower of Babel on here. I don't know if you can see it. It looks like a ziggurat structure. And it's got Nebuchadnezzar on here. And it's got an inscription. And it basically says that this is Nebuchadnezzar standing by this old dilapidated tower here. It was even in his day, it still existed. And there he was posing with it. That's pretty fascinating if you think about it. The Tower of Babel site, a lot of archaeologists, for example, Dr. Clifford Wilson died a few years back. He was a world-renowned archaeologist. He says this pool at modern Babylon is over the ruins of an early structure that was possibly the original Tower of Babel. If you look at that particular site, that site actually fits the description quite well. It was in ancient Babylon. And if you follow the historical account, yeah, this actually does make a lot of sense. Herodotus, an ancient historian, he was a Greek historian writing about the 5th century BC. He says, the tower was still in existence in his time, and it had a solid central tower, 1 stadium square, I don't know if I can have time to explain all that, with a second erected on top of it, and then a third, and then so on, up to 8. All 8 towers can be climbed by a spiral running along the outside, going up, and there are seats about halfway up for those who need to rest on their way up it, which I thought was kind of neat, which he, I guess, had the opportunity to walk up it. There are reconstructions of this tower. It's called the Etymonadki Tower. And I know you guys are impressed that I can pronounce that. But the Etymonadki Tower here. Now, this particular reconstruction only has about 7 if you count the very top. So Herodotus, who actually went up it, I think he might be a little bit more accurate if there really is 8 towers. If you look down at it from Google Earth, you can see the Etymonadki Tower. And if you follow this, it actually, 300 and 300, a stadia was 600 feet. So I wonder if that's the way he was counting this, by the way he mentioned square. But Alexander the Great in the BC 330s, or 330 BC here, he actually wanted the tower to be destroyed because it was old, dilapidated, falling down, having problems. So he ordered to have it destroyed because he wanted to rebuild it. Now what happened with Alexander the Great? He had an untimely early death. And as a result of that, it was torn down. The foundation was actually cored out, which is why you see the pools of water in there, but it was never rebuilt as a result of that. And so it passed into the pages of history. But we find ziggurats all over the world, don't we? People scatter, go to different parts of the world. Guess what? They take their building project with them. We find them, some of these type of ziggurats, even over here in the Americas. You go down to Central America, for example. But a pyramid is a specialized form of a ziggurat. And I thought that's kind of a neat little confirmation of what we see all around the world. Hey, what about all the languages? We have about 6,900 spoken languages in the world today. It's about 7,000 languages. Did they all come out of Babel? No, they didn't. Let me explain this. See, languages tend to change. You have different language families. So 6,900 spoken languages, how many people came out of Babel? Actually, if you tally all this up, you have a minimum of about 78 language families that came out of Babel. Now, I say a minimum, and there's a reason for it. Let me back up here for a moment. I don't know if Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth came out with a new language. It was in the days of Peleg. I don't know if he got a new language, but you have a listing of some other sons and daughters that we find out later on in Genesis chapter 11, so they may have come out with a new language. So a minimum of at least 78 language families. So you have 78 language families. How do you get to 7,000? Well, if you know anything about English, it tends to change. I've been over to England. They speak different over in England. I don't know if I can get that accent just right. Take off, eh? Up in Canada, Australia. Good on you, mate. Need I mention Tennessee? That's a beautiful accent, actually. Where I'm from, we have a Western Illinois choppy dialect that's going away. It's very similar to what Mark Twain used to have. I don't speak that way when I'm talking to you, but I'll cut into it with some of the old timers when I go home. But you see, English is constantly changing. And here's what you may not realize. English is classed as a Germanic language. English, German, Norwegian, Austrian, they're actually different forms of a German language. Just look at English going back into the past here. You follow this back. You go back 1,000 years ago, look at English. You can hardly read that. Fascinating, isn't it? That's from 1,000 years ago. You see, languages continue to change even today. The Tower of Babel triggered that, split those apart, and then they continue to go. Now, there are experts who look at different languages, Ethnologue, for example, or Vista Wide World Languages, and I know their numbers tend to vary every year, and I know sometimes people include constructed languages like Esperanto or even Klingon. Klingon's considered a language now. For those of you who know a little bit about Star Trek, people just exploded with that. So you have that. Sometimes computer languages like BASIC or Fortran, things like that, are actually included as languages. But, when you actually look at a lot of these actual language families and so forth, typically I've seen numbers anywhere from about 95 to 100 language families max. Now, like I said, those numbers tend to vary a little bit. But, we're right in the ballpark. A minimum of 78, you're looking 95, 100, we're right in the ballpark. This is completely different than an evolutionary worldview where all the languages supposedly came from a single grunting ape-like language. So as people go to different parts of the world, they take their languages, they continue to change, they intermix, and so forth. Well, by what means did people travel from the Tower of Babel? Well, they probably didn't take their 747s or their helicopters. But, some people did take their boats. From these, the coastline, that's the island or maritime peoples of the Gentiles, were separated into their lands, everyone according to their language and according to their families into their nations. That's in Genesis 10:5. Now think about this. Noah and his sons, master shipbuilders. Think about that for a moment. They built a ship that survived a global flood. They passed that technology on. If you think about this, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. His son Shem lived 500 years after the flood. We don't know how long Japheth or Ham lived. They could have lived longer than that. But they passed this technology down. Yes, of course, these guys are going to know how to build boats. There's an interesting example A number of years ago, back in 1969 and 1970, they built a couple of reed-style ships. They actually had people from South America come over and build these Egyptian reed-style ships. Ra 1 and Ra 2 is what they named them. Ra 2 set sail from Safi, Morocco in 1970 and landed in Barbados in 57 days. That's with supplies and everything. So yeah, they could traverse the Atlantic Ocean even with some of these old ships. What's interesting is the precursors to the Mayans and Olmec civilization here, they actually claim to have come by boat from the east, which would make them coming from Africa. And their language is actually very similar to that we find in West Africa, which I've always found fascinating. If you look at ocean currents, yeah, it'll bring you right over if you sail out this way. So it does make sense. Hey, do you think people walk to places like Australia or North America or Japan or England? You know, we look at our map today, you'd think, well, probably not. But think about this. The flood was a massive geological event. It affected weather patterns and many other aspects. Most creationists and evolutionists, we actually agree on something. We agree on an ice age. They have a whole bunch of ice ages going back in the past. We have one major ice age triggered by the flood. And what happens in an ice age is you take a lot of water out of the oceans and you put it on land. And so what happens is your ocean level ultimately drops. And that exposes land bridges. The Bering Sea land bridge up here, for example, you could walk all the way out to England or Japan, potentially even Australia. I know it's a little deeper in here, but there's a lot of tectonic activity there, so your ocean floor tends to change a little bit there. But you know, that explains how a lot of animals probably could have just walked to certain places. Well, what about all those peoples listed in Genesis chapter 10? Where did they go? Who are these people? Well, I want to look at these people in a little bit more detail. This is the fun part of the talk, or the really boring part of the talk, depending on how you want to look at it. But all these people, I look at these names so different now that I've studied this. Now, of course, Bible passages that talk further about these people are absolute. I did look at a lot of history, historians, ancient geographers, and maps. I did look at some language families, genetic studies, and even some mythology and oral tradition, though I don't put near as much stock in that kind of stuff. But Ham is one of Noah's 3 sons. He had 4 sons listed at the Tower of Babel: Mitzrayim, Put, Cush, and Canaan. Yes, that's how that's pronounced. You guys are familiar with Canaan, right? The land of Canaan. So you kind of know where Canaan went. That's where the Israelites ended up conquering. But let's just start with Cush. I don't know why I put Cush first, but I did. So I've got Cush here. Cush comes down and settles in certain parts of what we would know as the Arabian Peninsula down in here, comes across, settles in places like Ethiopia. A lot of Ethiopians still call themselves Cushites even today. And so they were in here. Nimrod remained at the Tower of Babel in this area and conquered in this area. Some of Hindu Kush, for example, came through Seba, one of Cush's sons. They even went all the way down the Malay Peninsula, some of them as far as Australia. We actually have genetic ties between some of the Cushites and the Australian Aborigines. If you look at Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim is the Hebrew name for Egypt. So you'll see Egypt in here. That's Mitzrayim in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, right behind it. One of his sons, the Lubim, the Lehabites, that is, they actually migrated over here. That's where the name Libya comes from. So you'll see that. The Philistines came out of one of the sons of Mitzrayim, the Cashlahites. Some of Mitzrayim actually went over and settled between India and China. There's still a region there called Mizoram that still reflects that name. If you look at Put originally came over and settled in Libya, but then ended up getting pushed out. Put got pushed out. How cool is that? Moves over to West Africa. A lot of the West African peoples came out of Put. A lot of the Moors, Moroccans, and Mauritania. Some of that, fact is, the Olmec probably would have because their language family is so similar, but much of West Africa. In fact, a lot of people who are descendants of the slave trade being brought over, a lot of them would probably be descendants, particularly of Put in here. In some cases, it could be some of the Cushites. A lot of the Cushites settled in the southern parts of Africa as well. If you just step back and look at those 3, much of Africa and part of the Middle East here were dominated by some of Ham's descendants. You can see how Cush continued to move down here, and so did a lot of Put's descendants. Now, if you look at Canaan, the land of Canaan was right in this general vicinity. Of course, they were judged by the Israelites. 7 of the tribes were overthrown and conquered by the Israelite nations as a result of a lot of their sin. But one group I want to point out, the Sinites here. See, the Sinites settled in the Sinai Peninsula. You might think of the wilderness of sin or Mount Sinai. A lot of these Sinites ended up migrating out and going all the way over to the Far East, China. They are descendants of the Sinites. You still see a reflection of their name as well. When they went to war with Japan, it was the Sino-Japanese War. Later in the Bible, they were related with Cineas. So it's kind of interesting to see those connections there. If you look at Japheth, Japheth had 7 sons listed at the Tower of Babel, and I'm actually going to leave Madai off of this list as I run through these, but let's run through them ever so briefly. You got Gomer, not to be confused with golly, Shazam. All you younger people out there have no idea what I just did. You'll have to ask your parents or grandparents. Yeah, some of you got it. But we have Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. So let's look at some of these guys. Gomer, particularly with his son Riphath. Riphath kind of came up, moved up in this area. Some people think the name Europe is actually a variation of Riphath. But Gomer particularly is where the Gaulish, Galatian, the Celts, those groups came out of. The ancient France is really where he's at. And you'll notice Galatia. Paul wrote to these Galatians, by the way. The old language of the Welsh is called Gomerang. So you still see a reflection there. One of the people groups that are within the boundaries of China today, the Mao or the Mid-South people, have a lineage that goes right back to Gomer as well, which is kind of neat. One of Gomer's sons, Ashkenaz, actually settled right up here north of the Black Sea. It used to be known as the Ashken Sea, which is a variation of his name. He moves up to Central Europe with 20 of his sons. One of them was Danius, Sarmatia, which is where the Sarmatians and the Danes and so forth came from. A lot of the Angles and Saxons came out of this group. Scandinavia is a variation of his name. Saxon. The Saxons actually are a variation of Ashkenaz's name as well. If you look at Gomer's son Togarmah, that's where a lot of the Turkish groups came from. The Turks dominated up in here until the Byzantine Empire waned in power, and then they came in here and conquered here. And so Turkey now has a relationship with Togarmah's descendants. Magog went up here and settled in the southern parts of Russia. A lot of the Slavic groups were up in here. The Greeks called him Scythia. That's where the name Scythians come from. So yeah, they're all up in this particular area. They intermix with a number of other people groups out here as well. Fact is, one of the groups over here, if you go over to Ireland has 3 ancient lineages that go back to Magog, which is quite fascinating as well. And the Scots intermixed with a lot of the Irish as well. If you look at Meshech settled in the northern parts of Russia. Moscow, Meshera lowland, the Meshera State Park. Moscow is an ancient name for Meshech, actually. A lot of the Baltic states, Finland, even some of the Huns came out of Meshech specifically. The Cappadocians mentioned in the Bible came out of Meshech as well. If you look at Javan, Javan is the Hebrew name for Greece. Every time you see Greece in the Old Testament, that's Javan behind that. Javan had 4 sons. Tarshish is one of those sons. Jonah was trying to get to Tarshish out here. What's interesting is Javan, they were some of the coastline people. They went out and settled all sorts of islands. A lot of people think Java Island, which is basically Javan Island. It was one of their seaports, as well as Japan was one of their early ports. Of course, they were dominated by Sinaites and other groups since that particular time. But you can see they actually survived in a lot of places around the Mediterranean Sea here. Tubal came up. Tubal actually went in 2 directions he had descendants go. The Greeks called him Iberes. Now, think of that for a moment, because you have the Iberian Peninsula. This was known as the land of Tubal. And so you can see that reflection there. You have Caucasian Iberia or Siberia, where you have Tobolsk and Tubal and the Tubal River. So you still see a relationship between some of that. We actually think some of these guys made it as far as the British Isles as well. Tyrus came in here and founded Thrace, or Bulgaria, used to be known as Thrace, and several of the islands in the Aegean Sea are actually related to some of the Native American tribes over here in the Americas. So they think that some of the Anacotti went up here. Maybe some people kept going for all we know. But we still see a reflection of some of their names in those particular areas as well. Now, of course, I left Madai off, and the reason for that is I'm going to relate him here to this first son of Shem. We have Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, Aram, and of course in Genesis chapter 11, apparently he had other sons and daughters as well. So you have Madai here. That's the northern part of what we call the Persian Empire. The Elamites mixed with the Persians, and then they mixed together, and you had the Medes and the Persians. Remember, Darius the Mede was a powerful ruler in the Persian Empire, just to give you a taste. There was the law of the Medes and Persians, which are mentioned as well. So that's this area. Some of them went as far as India. The Mitanni up here came out of the Medes as well. Asher started a very powerful empire very early on. And they became very powerful. Some of them went as far as into China. One of the people groups there can be related to Asher. The Assyrians were a very powerful nation that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were a downright evil nation at one stage, by the way. Arphaxad, this is where a lot of people in the Bible actually came from. The lineage of Jesus comes through Arphaxad, so naturally Abraham comes through there, Israel comes through there, the Edomites, descendants of Lot, that is, they came through Moab and Ammon, Edomites, they came through Esau. Moab and Ammon came through Lot. But you can see some of the other sons of Abraham with his later wife Keturah dominate some of these areas, and I always thought that was kind of interesting as well. Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees and so forth. So they dominated much of the Middle East. If you look at Shem's son Lud, he was in the southern part of what we call Turkey today. Now, a lot of these guys, they had an empire at one stage, but by and large, they were conquered by a lot of other peoples. Strabo, an ancient historian about 2,000 years ago, he mentioned that he only knew one city that still spoke the Lydian language here. So by and large, that language has predominantly gone extinct. We have records of some of it, and I know people have been deciphering that even recently. Aram. This is where the Arameans came from, the Syrians, Carthage, the Phoenicians came out of here as well. The Phoenicians were big time into sailing and that sort of thing. So they kind of spread out in these various areas. I just wanted to put Abraham in here. Even though Abraham was not in the Tower of Babel, if you consider his progeny actually dominated much of the Middle East, even parts of Africa. One of his grandsons, Epher over here, teamed up with the Greeks, went to war against the Libyans and conquered it. And so Epher ended up conquering this area. And the whole continent now is named for him. The land of Epher, or Ephraika, is actually named for one of Abraham's grandsons. I always thought that was kind of an interesting little sidebar on all that. But if you just step back, you can see where different people groups began expanding, going into different areas. Joktan, for example, he had 13 sons. 11 of them settled, well, they originally settled in Arabia, but 11 of those sons migrated over to the subcontinent of India. If you know much about India, it is a language melting pot. I knew a number of Indian guys in the lab that I was at many years ago. And a couple of these guys, they only lived a couple of miles from each other in India, but they can only communicate to each other through English, which was fascinating. But yeah, if you continue to just step back, you can see different people groups in different areas. Are you guys tired of maps yet? I love this stuff, and I get tired of the maps. But, the one that people ask about, what about the Americas? Because it is farther away. By the time people made it to the Americas, a lot of people had lost their written language. They're too busy doing other stuff. But I have been able to trace certain tribes coming in from various areas. You got Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Tyrus, the Sinites, Put, Seba, Joktan, and there's probably several others. And I know many people are still studying this subject, so I think it's kind of an exciting area of study, by the way. Okay. What about the decrease in ages? I do want to talk about this because if you think back, Adam lived 930 years old. Noah lived about 950 years old. Jared, 962. Methuselah, 969. Enoch didn't die. Good for him, right? But what about this decrease in age? You see Enoch here. He's translated off. That's always a fascinating one if you think about that. Who is the longest lived person in the Bible whose dad outlived him? And that's Methuselah. His dad never died, so he's still going on. But what about this decrease and this decline in ages? Because you get to a point here where Shem outlived great-great-great-great-great-grandsons. It's fascinating when you look at this. I would suggest this passage has nothing to do with it. Genesis 6:3, some people pointed to this. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." This is in the context of the countdown to the flood. So it's a 120-year countdown to the flood. That's what this context is at. And by the way, for 1,000 years after this declaration, people were living long beyond 120 years. In fact, even in our modern day, there's been a handful of people outlive 120 years. So what I would suggest is we need to look at this a little bit different. I would de-emphasize diet. Yes, there was a dietary change. Adam and his family Noah and his family were allowed to eat meat after the flood. But, there have been people who have been vegetarians. They don't live 900 years old. So we look at that. Increased oxygen, environmental changes, these might contribute a little bit. But by and large, based on the studies that we've seen, this is not allowing people to live those massive ages. I would suggest the main factor here is probably genetic bottlenecks at the flood and at the Tower of Babel. There might be some anatomical features and so forth as well, but if you just look, after Shem, we have 3 generations here that were on average living about 445 years. And then all of a sudden, after the events occurred after Babel, boom, they suddenly dropped down. You got 3 generations here where they were living on average of 236 years. So as soon as you start splitting up people, split people up as a result of the flood, split people up as a result of the Tower of Babel, things really changed. Imagine trying to find a job. 125 years experience required. I only have 96. I'm still not qualified. But there might be more to this. If you think of Shem was born before the flood. And yet he only lived 600 years. So there might be other genetic factors involved in this. But this actually relates to ancestor worship, by the way. How does this relate to ancestor worship? Do you realize cultures all over the world have ancestor worship? Shinto of Japan, Greek mythology or Germanic Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, Roman mythology, and so forth. A lot of these are ancestor worship. They would worship their ancestors. Why would they suddenly start worshiping their ancestors all over the world? Think about this. If you have a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather that's outliving you, are you going to look at him different? Yeah, people start looking at their ancestors different. If you look at the Greeks said that the gods or their immortals, they still died, they just outlived everyone else. It makes sense. People started looking at them differently because they were outliving everyone else. I mean, think of that. If you saw Shem, he still looks like he's a 45-year-old, and you're looking like you're about 95 and about to die. You're like, what's going on? That's my great-great-great-great-grand. You look at them different. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons for that. Are there any extra biblical accounts of a language split? Actually, we see them all over the world. And I'll just give you a taste of some of these. I know we've documented quite a few. But here's one from Plato. He was a Greek, writing in his book Critias. In the days of old, the gods, remember the gods, their ancestors who outlived everyone else but still died, had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. For there was no quarreling, for you cannot rightly suppose that the gods did not know what was proper for each of them to have, or knowing this, that they would seek to procure for themselves by contention that which more properly belonged to others. So see, they even knew that it was actually broken apart. The earth was split apart. Now, of course, these gods were not real gods by any means. There's only one God, and that is the Lord and Savior. Here's another one. The Maidu Indians of California says that during preparations for a special burning ceremony, when suddenly in the night, everybody began to speak a different tongue, except that each husband and wife talked the same language. Fascinating, isn't it? It's just fascinating. But let's not miss Christ at the Tower of Babel. Let's not miss it. I could talk for hours on the Tower of Babel, hours on racism and so forth, but let's not miss Christ in all this. You go back to Genesis 11:7. There's a fascinating verse here. Let us go down and confuse their language. Who is the us? That is a reflection of the triune God right there. That involves Jesus Christ right there. We see a reflection of that language, going back to Genesis 1:26. We see it in Isaiah as well. Let us make man in our image. That's a reflection of the triune God right there. Jesus was intimately involved in the events that occurred at the Tower of Babel. What about this? The name Lord used in this account. What is that name? The name Lord is Jehovah. That is a variation of I am. That was used in Exodus 3:14. I am who I am. That was a name revealed to Moses. Jesus used that name in John 8:58. Before Abraham was, he said, I am. The Jews wanted to stone him because they're like, you're claiming to be God. Well, Jesus is God. God who stepped into history to become a man. Consider the mild judgment, especially when it wasn't too long after the flood, a very violent judgment that judged a very violent group of people. But consider Christ, what he did. Jesus Christ steps into history to become a man, to become our relative, to die on the cross in our place, to be a substitutionary atonement where the infinite Son of God takes the infinite punishment from the infinite Father on behalf of our sin. The infinite Son took that punishment, and only he could do it. And that was enough to satisfy God's wrath upon sin, and that's what makes salvation possible. Friends, I want to encourage you to consider the claims of Jesus Christ. I want to consider you to stand up in today's culture and fight against racism. Fight for our brothers and sisters all around the world.